Welcome, everyone. We'll begin in just a moment. All right, let's begin. Thank you for joining our Croatan conversation on trends in sustainable and impact investing in the United States. I'm Josh Humphreys, President and Senior Fellow of Croatan Institute, an independent nonprofit research institute whose mission is to harness the power of investment for social good and ecological resilience. This conversation, which the Institute is pleased to host, is part of our larger series of Croatan conversations, bringing leaders into deep dialogue about collaborative opportunities to invest in solutions to some of the world's toughest social and environmental challenges. To start with, I just have a few housekeeping items for participants. This conversation is being recorded and will become available afterward on our website and our YouTube page, which I encourage you to go to and subscribe. In order to stay abreast of not only our Croatan conversations, but other online content from the Institute. Zoom attendees can ask questions using the Q&A box at any time, and our team will do our best job to get those curated for us so that Lisa and I can address them at the end of the presentation. And if you're watching on YouTube, on our live stream, you can also post your questions in the comments box there on YouTube. And again, our team will capture those and bring them into dialogue. Now, because we're talking about investments, we have kind of the typical disclaimers. And the basic idea here is that we're here not to provide any kind of investment advice or recommendations, and we certainly aren't making any kind of solicitations. We're simply providing information about the capital markets. Now, with that, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our next and upcoming Croatan conversation. In January next year, our senior fellow, Charlene Brown, who directs the Institute's Racial Equity, Economics, Finance, and Sustainability Initiative, also known as REEFs, will moderate a discussion on investing in racial equity a half century after the Civil Rights Movement, with several of our most active REEF steering committee members, including Keith Beverly of Grid 202 Partners, Vicki Lee Parker High of the North Carolina Business Council, and Mike Lear of the Capital Group. And this conversation is generously underwritten by Trillium Asset Management. And so we're really appreciative of that. For more details and to register for this next Croatan conversation, please visit croatanconversations.org. And we'll also post the registration links in the chat for those of you who are on Zoom. Now, I'm really pleased to be joined today by Lisa Woll, CEO of US SIF, the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment. It just seems like a great occasion to bring Lisa together into dialogue about trends here at the end of the year, particularly since US SIF has just released its biennial report on trends in sustainable and impact investing in the United States. Now, a few words about Lisa. She joined US SIF in 2006, 1 year after I first advised US SIF Foundation on its biennial trends report. And the organization has just grown considerably under Lisa's leadership over the last decade and a half, or nearly so. And the field itself has literally exploded, as recent trends reports document and demonstrate. Lisa came to US SIF after leading the International Women's Media Foundation, and she has a longstanding commitment to human rights. She directed the Washington office of Save the Children, directed the first major study on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and served on the Advisory Council of Human Rights Watch's Children's Division. And before her international work in human rights, Lisa cut her teeth on domestic social policy in New York and on Capitol Hill. So she just has a particular passion for the social dimension of sustainable investing, as we'll hear about today. Barron's has called her, named her among the 20 most influential people in ESG investing. She was awarded the first Forbes Impact Award. I could go on and on about Lisa's accolades, but let me simply welcome her to this Croatan conversation.
Thanks, Josh. I'm happy to do, our second webinar together in a month.
It is that time of year.
It is.
Well, in any case, we are here at the end of a rough year, but one that feels like it's turning in the right direction. Why don't you begin just by saying a few words about US SIF, about the US SIF Foundation's Trends Report for those who may be unfamiliar with the organization, and this major report that was just released a few weeks ago.
Sure. Well, thanks for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. For those of you who may not be aware of US SIF, we're the leading organization in the US advancing sustainable and impact investing across all asset classes. And our membership ranges from financial advisors, mutual funds, asset owners, data and research providers, and nonprofit organizations. So a whole range of actors who are engaged in the investment process. The strategies we use to advance the field are research, like what Josh and I will kick off our conversation with, our recent trends report, but multiple other reports that we put out per year, education programming to give financial professionals the tools they need to be able to do sustainable and impact investing, our policy work, which I know we'll talk about today, convenings, usually in person back in the day and hopefully in the future, as well as virtual convenings now. And then a lot of member services that we provide, including webinars for our members, opportunities to talk to each other over listservs, and an opportunity to be on committee. So our goal really is to advance the field broadly and to serve our members as well, but to really get the most important influential bodies to be doing sustainable investing, because that will help move the field forward. So that's what US SIF is. And US SIF Foundation does our research work and our education work. So what we'll be talking about is this report that just came out in November, our trends report. That's done every 2 years. It measures the size of the market across asset classes in the US. It looks at the biggest ESG trends and other trends as well. And then it is one of the primary feeders into the Global Sustainable Investment Report, which we do with the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance, which we were a co-founder of, every 2 years. So that report will come out somewhere between the end of the first quarter and beginning of the second quarter of next year. And Josh has been very involved. Well, he's been involved in trends before even I got to US SIF. So it's been a while, Josh.
Yeah. All roads lead to trends. And we should be clear about that. Yeah, the Croatan Institute team plays a pretty important role alongside the research team at US SIF Foundation. So we're always happy to collaborate with US SIF on this really important benchmarking report for the scale and scope of the field and all its diversity. So let's dig into it. Big picture headline from the trends report this year is that sustainable and impact investing in the US has grown at a healthy pace over the last 2 years to more than $17 trillion. It's a 2-year increase of 42%. And what that means, big picture, is that we are tracking that 1/3 of the more than $50 trillion in combined total assets under professional management in the US are now involved at some level in sustainable and impact investing, whether through the incorporation of environmental, social, and governance factors, ESG, into the investment process in some shape, fashion, or form, or through shareholder advocacy. As you may imagine, a group like US SIF has been doing this exercise well before even Lisa and I got involved with US SIF. Indeed, it goes back a quarter century to 1995. The first trends report was released under the title After Apartheid. And since that time, we are measuring a compound annual growth rate of 14% over that last quarter century, which is an impressive CAGR in the field. So beyond these big picture headlines, obviously ESG is growing. It's getting adopted across a broader array of the financial services industry in the US. When we talk about nearly a third of financial services and investment in the US now touching ESG and shareholder advocacy in some shape. When big players like this start getting involved, Lisa, how do we make sense of these kinds of multi-trillion-dollar figures?
Yeah, so one thing, Josh, I thought I might do, if you can see this, everyone, this is the how quickly the field has grown in the last less than a decade. So you can see most of the growth has been since 2012, which is almost like a straight up and down growth. And you can find this on our website, several of these graphs and charts. What I would say is that we're at a really interesting point in the field right now, because what happened in 2014 is that for the first time in our responses from the field, we saw this thing called unidentified ESG integration. And our research director and I looked at that and said, what is that? What is happening in the field? This is really the first time we saw this. So this is about 6 years ago. And we did a report at that time called ESG integration, kind of what's real and what's not, which was actually a little controversial for us because it put us in the position of kind of critiquing the field. What were we doing right and what were we not doing right? And I think it was the right thing to do. And what we found out by looking at several large asset managers was that some of them were very straightforward about what they were doing in terms of broad ESG integration. Some of them told us they were using it across entire portfolios of all their funds. They were not. And some of them had very little information, transparency, and accountability about what they were doing at all. And so one of our strategic goals since then, every time we've done a strategic plan, is to help the field advance so that there's more accountability, more transparency, and that firms, when they take this on, are getting the tools, the expertise that they need to perhaps start off at a more basic level and then move on to more integrated and deeper dive strategies. So that's what we would like to see. But certainly the trends report, as you know, Josh, in that $17 trillion figure, much of that was in assets that don't have really well-defined ESG criteria identified with them. They're reported to us as using ESG, but we don't know in a lot of those situations what specific criteria they're using. And that's an area we want to continue to focus on because we want to see a little bit more transparency. And in a minute, I can fill you in a little bit on some of the interesting things some of the big firms have said over the last couple of days related to sustainable investment.
Yeah, so I think you're kind of alluding to it already. We're seeing calls globally, in fact, right? You've mentioned the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance. There's obviously a lot of development in Europe along these lines as well. Calls for greater standardization of the field in light of this phenomenon you described, more disclosure, more reporting frameworks. There are taxonomies emerging. Obviously, for a good decade, we now within the impact investing space have impact reporting and measurement. We now have ratings. Very mainstream financial services firms are developing ESG ratings of the actual products themselves, not just providing ESG ratings of underlying companies or issuers. So what is your view on these developments from your perch at US SIF? How do leaders in the field address the charges that are emerging of ESG light investing, greenwashing, impact washing, when you have this kind of limited transparency?
Well, it's interesting because just a day ago, the Investment Company Institute, which is has members with funds of 34 trillion in AUM, said that they're encouraging US public companies to provide enhanced reporting on ESG factors. Well, we've been asking the SEC for that since 2009, and we will continue to ask the new SEC when it convenes in 2021 to do that. It asks that companies provide disclosure consistent with the TCFD and SASB. So that was very interesting because they had actually never come out with a statement like this before. And so I think that's one indication of kind of one of the paths The other thing that's really interesting is that yesterday, Deutsche Bank announced annual growth targets for sustainable investment and said they were going to tie compensation to the volume of ESG investments flowing through the firm. And in some ways, you think that's a good thing because it's making it a priority. And in some way, you worry that if compensation is attached to it, there may be a rush to the floor instead of the ceiling in terms of sort of the integration of ESG criteria in a meaningful way. But clearly, they understand that this is a massive level of interest for clients and potential clients. BlackRock just put out a report, I think actually today, that show that the sustainable investment transition is occurring around the world, and that they are seeing, hold on a sec. They're seeing that 75% of respondents reported that they either would or already use an integrated ESG approach, and that respondents globally plan to double their allocations to ESG assets under management by 2025. So I think what we see with both of these kinds of streams, you've got one part of the field saying we need much better disclosure from companies. You have another part of the field saying we see this as a massive, massive growth opportunity, and we want to make sure we're well positioned. And then you have several different sorts of regulatory ideas from the CFA Institute, for example, to actually define funds, so that this idea that you won't be able to look at a fund and really understand what they're doing doesn't continue to occur. So you're right, Josh. The ask for regulations is coming in different ways. ESG disclosure by companies, disclosure of what funds actually do and kinds of funds for mutual funds, and then this real acknowledgement that the field is exploding and everybody wants to be on that train and what those implications are 5 years from now. All of those things are happening at the same time. I have to say it's an extraordinary time to be in this field. I've never seen a moment like this, which I think has been enhanced by the fact that we have a new administration coming in. So all of those things together, it's a lot to think about and a lot to look at.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of remarkable from a long-term perspective. I know I've been working in sort of along the edges of what used to be called the social investing space since the late 90s. And there just was not the focus of mainstream financial institutions along the lines of the Investment Company Institute, which is the trade group for the mutual fund industry, and broader groups like the CFA Institute. Obviously, there's a lot of important stakeholder dynamics engaging with each of these professional bodies. It's real. So it's really interesting. Ultimately, though, yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
I'll say, you brought up sort of what's happening in Europe. And so Europe has a sustainable finance plan. Australia has one. They just came out with it last week. Canada has one. The UK has one. What's interesting about this, and I see this conversation starting to happen in the US, is that these all started out as sustainable finance plans, which for us in the US, that means ES&G. They've all turned into green finance plans. Right. And green taxonomies. And there's a lot of different policy papers being written right now for the new administration, and we're often asked to look at them. And one of the things that's happening is that same confusion. People start out talking about ESG, and then they go into green. And I really think people have to be careful about that, because green is an incredibly important part of what we need to be looking at in the investment process and at a much broader societal scale, climate change. But ESG is broader than that. And my concern with so many of these countries that have taken on a green taxonomy and a green finance plan is not that that's a bad thing. It's not at all. But that how many bites at an apple are we going to get to do a sustainable finance plan anywhere? And have we lost the opportunity to make sure we're looking at social issues and good governance issues, which oftentimes impact whether we have good E and S policies. So that's something also to really keep an eye on. And I know Europe, for example, is very keen to see the US do something like they have done. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good two-step to kind of get beyond the headline. This is one of the challenges of the trends report when it comes out is it's big, it's long, but it's the big numbers that usually drive the attention. We obviously have spent a lot of time over the last decade and a half, exploding the report, as I like to say, exploding the data in the report so you can really see the micro trends. So you mentioned the green side of things. Obviously, environmental issues are a really important component of this universe. And let's spend a little bit of time talking about those leading specific ESG trends rather than just at the macro level, even though that's driving a lot of the growth, particularly in mainstream finance. So on the environmental side, quantitatively, we do see climate change, carbon risk as among, indeed, the leading overall ESG factor reported by money managers. We quantified it at over $4 trillion affecting assets. We also saw really rapid growth over the last 2 years in specific environmental issues like sustainable natural resources, including agriculture, something that we work on at the Institute quite a bit. More than 80% growth in that one arena to affect more than $2 trillion in combined assets under management now. So what is driving, this preponderance of green within the space, would you say?
Well, what I think will be really interesting, and maybe this is a different way to answer it, is 5 years from now, if this administration, incoming administration, the president-elect, has actually been able to create policy to deal with climate change, carbon, will we see the same emphasis on green investing? Because what I feel is that because we have been really without any great ability to impact the climate crisis over the last 10 years, because even Obama largely did this through executive orders, right. Because he couldn't get legislation through Congress. So if you look at it that way, I oftentimes think that the investment process steps in for the lack of federal policy making. You see it in the increase, for example, on prison-related involvement by investors, and for example, guns and weapons, because again, another area that's begging for policy reform. So I think a big piece of it is a lot of businesses and investors have understood that it was up to the private sector if anything was going to get moved forward around climate and carbon and the range of related issues like water. It was going to have to be driven by the private sector. I think that's a big piece of it. I think investors, whether it's a retail investor who's got $100 or a massive high net worth individual or institutional investor, are very interested in ensuring that they address climate, because we all understand what an unbelievable risk it is and that we're probably too late in addressing this to the degree it needs to be addressed. And so it's absolutely, I think, for most investors, both from a shareholder perspective, but also from a portfolio management perspective, one of the top 3 issues for every investor is something related to climate change. And I think that will continue because we're going to need multiplicity of different approaches to get this crisis under control, from policy to investment to companies increasingly taking on net zero commitments. So it's an all-in situation for the next 10 years if we hope to survive this.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point about policy. We'll come back to that, I think, hopefully by the end of the hour, to think a little bit more about this, whether indeed there is a sort of cycle. There's a Trump bump that I think the ESG field benefited from considerably, actually, for precisely this reason you described, the lack of policy. And yet as it hardens in policy, all the more reason finance has to take it seriously. So again, you have an interesting bifurcation going on between politics and economics. So on the social dimension, I mean, that's kind of what you mentioned at the outset here is that sometimes when we talk about sustainability, we end up only thinking about green issues. But obviously, along the social dimension, this is also an important set of considerations for sustainable and impact investors. We know the big headlines were around conflict at risk, as often big, large public plans still have no buy lists associated with conflict risk, terrorist and repressive regimes. So we see that quantitatively. But the trends report in 2020 really provides a snapshot at the beginning of the year in terms of the quantification. And obviously, we've had 2020. So, and everything that has followed from that, the world's been utterly transformed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the US, we've had an explosion of public protest and outrage over the ongoing racial justice crisis, which doesn't seem to be tempering by any means. So how have sustainable investors responded to these kinds of critical social trends that aren't obviously reflected in beginning of year quantitative data.
Yeah, so I think the next trends report will be really interesting because we will be able to see whether the kind of the areas of social engagement in terms of shareholder engagement and the areas of social criteria in portfolios changed over the last 2 years. In the meantime, what we do know is, for example, there was a group of investors who early on in the COVID crisis sent letters to hundreds of publicly traded companies. And because they wanted to make sure they handled COVID appropriately and asked them to provide paid leave, to prioritize health and safety, to maintain employment, i.e. don't fire people, to maintain supplier and customer relationships, and to undertake financial prudence. So the highest level of ethical financial management and responsibility. Groups like Just Capital have really worked with companies and they've graded them on how they've done. I won't spend time on that, but if people are interested in that, they certainly can go check out that website. But certainly investors have been talking far more about issues like pay and benefits. And I think, we got very involved. I wouldn't say very involved. We got involved in the COVID conversation. We wrote a letter signed by our investors and others to the president and to the House and Senate leadership, because we had appointed about five months after COVID started that we saw massive unemployment, businesses not being able to even begin to make decisions about how to open. Even in our own little nonprofit, we sit at DC, Virginia, and Maryland, all of whom have different rules about COVID. And I'm trying to figure out, what do we do? And so we wrote a letter and we said, we need PPE, we need more stimulus, we need all kinds of things in order to change the COVID trajectory, which of course has not changed yet. We also included in our policy document, which we'll talk about later, a minimum wage raise to $15 an hour and a requirement for paid leave. We've never gotten involved in those issues before, but I think US SIF, along with many of our members and other investors, have said, this cannot go on. You cannot have a sustainable economy with a minimum wage at a quarter of really what it should be, and people who can't get paid leave and go to work sick. And it's one of the reasons we end up with the pandemic getting worse. So on the COVID side, I think people are very much focused on how do they impact on these issues. And I think we'll see investors increasingly involved. On the racial justice front, racial justice policy, really sits at so many different levels, both at if you look at the criminal justice system, where a lot of the cash bail issues, the over-incarceration of people of color, the lengthy sentences that are out of whack with virtually any other democracy on earth, many of those issues sit at the local and the state level. So, but we did see investors again put out a paper on racial justice and asking for investors to create more diversity. I mean, the financial services field has never been known to be the most diverse profession on earth, and the need for there to be more diverse asset managers, and then as well to look at racial justice investing. So in many ways, like gender investing 5 years ago, we're seeing a sort of uptick in investment products that can help address racial justice issues, equity, inclusion, diversity. At US SIF, the three things we have done, we created a small board committee to look at this. We have looked at our own diversity efforts. We have been able to have a much diverse board than staff to date, and that's something we are working on. We're working with a small member racial justice task force to both create a resource page for all investors that can come to our page and find out all the different racial justice opportunities there are for investing across the country. And we'll be putting a racial justice toolkit together next year that doesn't just look at investments, but looks at how you can take on these issues as well in your personal life. How can you get involved in organizations that are looking at racial justice issues, at prison reform issues, at wage issues, at hiring issues, and get involved at a policy level in your own personal life. So we want to give people resources who are our members to make changes that they feel they want to be involved in that they can't get involved in their professional life. So those are the three things we're looking at, but this will continue, I believe, to be an important conversation, a very needed conversation in our field.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should get your toolkit hooked up with our Reefs initiative. as you guys come out with that. I know we're going to be releasing some total portfolio approaches to racial equity investing in the year to come. So really exciting.
Okay.
Some of which will be spotlighted in our January conversation. So you alluded to it, Lisa, already. Another key part of the trends report is tracking investor advocacy. Historically, the methodology of the report, which we've inherited and helped to evolve over the years, has really focused on measuring the assets of investors that file or co-file shareholder resolutions. But of course, you've already alluded to it. We see an explosion of other forms of advocacy engagement that may not focus on simply the filing or co-filing shareholder resolutions. They may be sign-on letters, fixed income engagement by bondholders, which doesn't have the proxy process that shareholders have. And then, of course, policy advocacy, something that I think can safely be said has been one of your chief priorities at US SIF. So how do you view this really diversifying advocacy landscape within the field right now?
Yeah, so maybe just for a minute, I could talk a little bit about some of the shareholder findings in the trends report, which we found that 149 institutional investors and 56 money managers filed resolutions. Public facing institutions, public pension funds and others had the most assets engaged in shareholder resolutions, and faith-based investors brought the most proposals. So that's kind of interesting. And the resolutions filed, the top one was disclosure of corporate political spending. Of course, that tells us a lot about where a company may be going. Regulations to curb greenhouse gas emissions, again, a climate change issue. And then labor and employment, and then climate change. So the greenhouse gas emissions and climate change were seen as separate issues. So those were the four. And so you don't hear in that, other than labor, you have two climate related issues and one what I'd call corporate governance issue in terms of political spending. And we had a board call yesterday and several of our members are shareholder advocates. And what we heard is that they intend to really up the number of shareholder proposals they intend to bring next year. So I'm waiting to see if 2021 is really a banner year for shareholder proposals, particularly on climate and social issues. I really think we're going to see an uptick in both. And then you want me to talk a little bit about public policy?
Yeah, and you know, naturally, we just had an extremely consequential election in the United States. So perhaps in that context, policy advocacy becomes extremely salient. How does an industry react to this political shift going on? How do you see that, affecting sustainable investing going forward under a Biden administration?
Yeah, so I call it the transition from saying, no, we oppose, please don't. That's been what we've done most of the last 4 years. We have really had no opportunity to play a role in terms of moving things forward. It's mostly been trying to stop things from being rolled back, which we, like many of our colleagues, have been largely unsuccessful at. And most of it done regulatorily by the administration, particularly the SEC and the DOL. But it is a new day. And earlier this year, US SIF spent several months putting together what we call our policy recommendations towards a just and sustainable economy for the new administration. And I will say that I started moving US SIF down the path of working on public policy 8 to 10 years ago. And the reason why is that if you want to have systemic change, you have to be involved in the systemic change process. And we will not invest ourselves out of every really difficult environmental and social issue. It's just not possible. Investment is a very, very good strategy, but it's one of many. And at the end of the day, even the financial services industry sits in the framework set by the US government. And so it's very important for us to be involved in that. It's very important for our members, particularly medium and large size financial services firms that have political capital, they have social capital, and they just have plain old capital. All of those things are influential. And trying to get them involved in talking about sustainable finance, sustainable business practices, versus perhaps some of the conversations that have been happening at the Chamber of Commerce or the Business Roundtable is incredibly important. And so I think this is an ongoing area of work to try to get sustainable investors to be more engaged in the policy process, both in Washington and at home. So we have always thought it was a systems changer in the same way that we really try to work and educate the media. and try to place a lot of opinion pieces. Again, systems changer. You're educating people who might want to get engaged. So that's the kind of why we do it. And I'm happy to talk a little bit of what the how is, if you'd like me to.
Yeah, sure. I think that could be helpful. I think this is kind of the reminder in a lot of ways as advocacy trends emerge. We may indeed, as part of the trends report, need to update our methodologies to try to figure out other ways of quantifying this. And it's not easy to quantify. And indeed, the research committee that advises US SIF Foundation on this report has, heretofore been really hesitant to simply allow any response about engagement to get suddenly quantified. It would actually make the universe even larger.
Right.
We know a lot of folks have ESG policies related to proxy voting, for example. So just casting a proxy vote in favor of an ESG resolution doesn't meet the bar of quantification as we track this trend, but we actually pay close attention to it. We have some interesting data in the report on actual votes. We see a lot of majority votes going on, but the fact of the matter is that voice is beyond votes, right? And voice is an extremely important component of advocacy, and that's what you bring to policy. Potentially there are some votes ultimately when elections, actually come to bear, but bear their fruit. But the fact of the matter is just simply having a voice, and the investor voice is one that I think is listened to quite carefully by legislators. They pay attention.
Well, and maybe a couple things to share from that, and then I can talk about some specific things we're going to look at in this new administration. Is one, I always try to be very actionable in what I say to people. So I always ask our members at our conference, how many of you have on your press release list? Everyone who has a firm has a press release list. I guarantee you that. Have your governor, your state legislator, your mayors, your city council people, your members of Congress. Almost none. Like that is, if you don't tell policymakers what you do, they don't know what you do. They don't know what the field does. They don't know that we exist. They think of the business world as this very old-fashioned idea of business. We need to change that. When we have our conference in Washington, in those days when you would meet in Washington, and we would ask folks to go up to the Hill for Hill Day, we get 70 or 80 people. When we do it outside of Hill Day, when people aren't in Washington, we get a much smaller amount, which tells me that it's important to people if we make it easy, but it's not as important if it takes a next step. So that's something we really want to change. In terms of what we're asking this new administration for, well, we really believe that personnel can be policy. So particularly at the agencies that we do a lot of work with, the field does a lot of work with, the DOL and the SEC. We've asked that all senior appointments, obviously at the SEC, senior commissioners, the chair, the heads of investment management, the heads of corporate finance, at the DOL secretary, the head of EBSA, Employment Benefits Security Administration, the deputy secretary of EBSA. Those are all people who have incredible ability to move this field forward or not. They need to understand what sustainable investment is. They need to understand how you use ESG data. They need to understand evolving ideas of fiduciary duty. So that's very important. We have suggested that the White House create an Office of Sustainable Finance and Business to take advantage of the trajectory of sustainable investment and this continuing conversation about what's being called stakeholder capitalism, but is really about how do you think about companies really as more of the social fabric than as short-term providers of profit. And so we think there's an opportunity for this administration to work more closely with the sustainable business and investor community to move some of their own agenda items forward, and that there can be a role for this field. We want to see the rollbacks at the SEC around limitations on shareholder engagement. We want to see rollbacks at the DOL on their definition of how you can or cannot use ESG factors in ERISA governed pension plans. And we expect an equally bad ruling coming down anytime in the next week on fiduciaries being able to vote their proxy. So we already know we want to reverse it, and we don't know even what's in it yet. The climate regulations that have been rolled back have been egregious. We want to see them all reversed. The largest retirement plan in this country is a federal thrift plan. We've been working with them for 8 years to try to get a mutual fund window established, which they have legislative authority to do, and to add some sustainable investment options. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm optimistic with this administration. And then CDFIs. I think some of you probably are invested in a community investment credit union bank, loan fund. We'd like to see that appropriation increase dramatically because they have been such important voices and institutions, both responding to COVID and racial injustice and so many other issues across urban, rural, and indigenous communities. So we want to see more funding going there. So we think we can invest our way towards the world we want, but we also must at the same time engage in policy that can change the frameworks of the world we live in.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of it is probably in the first 100 days is going to be a little status quo ante. Let's bring back, what.
Yeah, let's go back to 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Right.
But we've got a proactive agenda around this new office of sustainable finance and business. And obviously the CDFI fund is a real important object of attention. The catalytic capital that comes from government support has been really critical in growing the field. And we see pretty impressive growth in the trends report on community investing if you're interested in that. So check out that part of the report. Within the Money Managers chapter, over $200 billion now in the CDFI space across those institutions Lisa mentioned. So this will be my final question before turning it over to the audience Q&A that our team is teeing up. So don't hesitate to add any questions into the YouTube comments or the Q&A box, and our team will bring them into our attention. So my last question is really about the future of the field. How do we move it forward? You've already described the policy agenda that you've put forward, but I think more broadly within the field in terms of professional development, I mean, to say that 1/3 of assets under management now can be considered involved in sustainable and impact investing still means that the vast majority of finance and investment remains outside the tent. 2/3 doesn't even try to greenwash. They just say, forget it. So what will it take to broaden the field even further and hold those lighter touch new ESG entrants to account for their work?
Yeah. So certainly a big part of it is how do you train investment professionals who have clients to understand the field? So towards that, we've put together just over the last 8 years when we began to see that advisors might not be an open door for the field because they just didn't know enough about it to have conversations. So we have the first designation in the US, the SISRIC designation, the SRI counselor designation with the College for Financial Planning. It's the only designation in the US. Several hundred people have gotten this accreditation in the last year and a half since it's been available. And we've heard really great things from the advisors who have gotten it. We have a Fundamentals of Sustainable Impact Investing course that's largely geared towards advisors, a 3-hour course. We're actually doing a virtual version of it on Thursday, if people are interested in that. It's actually tomorrow. The course is tomorrow. You can go to our website and sign up if you'd like. And we have a retail course, which is brand new for 30 minutes, very basic for an average retail investor who might want to find a mutual fund or get in a community investment note, but who knows nothing about the field and probably, like many Americans, is somewhat financially illiterate because we're never really taught about finances. That's a whole nother webinar to discuss. So we think there needs to be more education. We want to see more products that retail investors can get engaged in that might feel more like an impact investment to them, which is a whole conversation in and of itself. The media has really picked up their coverage of this field over the last several years, particularly in the trades. We haven't seen as much in what I call the general finance or just general interest publications. I'd like to see more of that. That's upon all of us to be having that conversation with a broader group of media. And then at some point, we do really need to deal with financial illiteracy in this country because we should not be able to graduate from high school without a basic course in investment, very basic. But I would say probably 80% to 90% of people graduate from high school and know nothing about investment whatsoever. That is a shame. And then we really need to figure out how do we drive retirement plans to have one or more investment options, because unless you're a wealthy person and you have a lot of discretionary income that you can invest in whatever asset class you choose with whatever advisor or consultant you have or family office, if you're a retail investor, a lot of your discretionary income is going into a retirement plan. If you want to live in the US and you know you're going to be responsible for making sure you're not poor when you retire from your job, that's the number one place you're going to be worrying about putting money. So we don't have enough options in private or public retirement plans. So one of my big takeaways for anyone on this webinar is if you're the boss of your institution and you don't have a sustainable investment option in your retirement plan, you should surely add one. And if you're not the boss, and you should go to your HR department or your boss or to the plan sponsor and say, we would really like one or more sustainable investment options in our retirement plan. That is the number one way we're going to drive assets in this space in the next 10 years.
Great. Yeah. It's exciting to hear. I think the financial literacy component is something that we're focused increasingly on too, particularly once you get thematic, right? The idea of getting greater investment in frontline climate solutions means the need for real serious investment readiness on the part of those people who would be recipients of capital. Investees need to have greater financial readiness and financial literacy. We see it repeatedly across ag, community development, and the like. So completely agree. And obviously just dealing with income inequality, the wealth gap, particularly the racial wealth gap, financial health resiliency is a really important component of that. Let's go to the Q&A. Our team has received a few questions, and maybe we'll start on the racial side. So just a clarifying question, what are some of the steps that US SIF is taking to diversify its staff and board, and what can allied professional organizations, Black organizations, other groups working with professionals of color do to help US SIF on this journey?
Well, the board is, we actually have a fairly diverse board right now. We just had an election yesterday, although we have not sent out the results yet. The staff, we would love if folks have ideas for organizations we should be sharing job descriptions with. If they have listservs that they're a part of that have a diverse set of financial professionals or folks who would like to be financial professionals but know enough about the industry to work for us, we would love that. We are very, very enthusiastic about deeply expanding the ways we can get out the word about working at US SIF. So anybody on today's webinar who has some ideas about that, feel free to email me after this, and I would be so pleased to engage with you on that.
And I think you have an opening.
We do. Our director of research and education, who's been at US SIF even longer than me, has just retired, although fortunately she's still working for us as a consultant for a while. And that's a big job. That's a sort of one of the top 3 jobs at US SIF, part of the internal management team. It's a great job. You get to talk at a lot of events, talk to a lot of people, work with a lot of people. So if anyone's interested in that, check out our website.
Yeah, obviously, we look forward to working with the future director of research at US SIF as we do research together. So more substantively, let's go back in terms of the ESG policy environment in particular, rather than what's going on in US SIF internally. We see some questions about policy, and going back to that observation you made about, implicitly the Trump bump when policy doesn't rise to the occasion, investors have. Does that lead you to have some concerns about, the scale and scope of ESG investing potentially declining under the new administration with a more supportive environment for policy? And have you perhaps seen that in any of your global work in other regions around the world where you get supportive policy, that you actually see a decline in ESG investing?
I would be shocked if we saw that. I mean, just the stuff that I read this morning from Deutsche and BlackRock. I mean, those are calls to action that recognize that this has become, I always get asked by journalists, when is ESG going to be all investing? That question's so simple that in a way it's too simple, because it's a much more, I think, complicated answer than, when it's 70% or 80%. You have to define what you want that investing to look like. And I want it to have lots of different ways people can invest, from firms that are doing super deep dives and doing shareholder engagement and best in class and screening out the really poor performers, and really engaging with their clients. And I also think it's really important we have some firms that are doing a lighter touch ESG integration, as long as they explain what that is. And the buyer of that fund does not feel like they have been misled.
Right.
So I think we want to have lots of different options. And I actually think for some of the early adopter firms who have largely been sort of the more multiple strategy firms, deeper dive firms. I actually think this is also a great moment for them. As you can tell, because a lot of firms are buying them up to be part of the bigger firms, because people will also be hungry for that. They'll be hungry for a greater, deeper dive impact, and others will be very happy with more sort of ESG integrated funds.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting to think about the proliferation of strategies, the differentiation opportunities for firms that really are authentic at a time when it's going to be pretty easy to sort the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Also along the lines of policy, but particularly around climate, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse commented in a recent SOCAP session that there's a disconnect between corporate public assertions of climate action and what they actually lobby for in Congress. Have you witnessed this kind of non-alignment? How have sustainable investors responded to that paradox?
Well, Senator Whitehouse has spoken at our conference and done some conference calls with us, and this is one of the things that really bothers him very much. And I think what will be interesting to see over the next several years is a lot of investors who said they're staying all in, and companies who said they're staying in. You know, they still want to see us move back in the Paris Agreement. What will that look like in the next 10 years? Will we have, you know, in the first years of the Biden administration, increasing number of investors, big investor firms and companies going up to Congress and asking for true climate change policies? And so I think Senator Whitehouse has largely been right. I think there has been very little appetite by most companies to go up to Congress and ask to be regulated. I think that will change over the next several years. And even if it doesn't, I don't think the Biden administration is going to wait for permission.
Right. And as you mentioned in summarizing some of the shareholder trends, one of the leading issues was, in fact, on corporate political spending and lobbying. It should be said, I don't know if you mentioned lobbying, but that is part of that category, is holding companies accountable for their lobbying, which often involves kind of indirect political spending of sorts.
Right.
A final policy question has popped in related to the ERISA matters, that is to say, the pension fund matters within the Department of Labor. And the question is simply, would it be better tactically to revise the anti-ESG pension provisions that are emerging related to fiduciary duty and SRI ESG plan fund options, or to file lawsuits, you know, to get more contingents that way and just have them invalidated by law?
So I'm going to offer a third option, and that's in our policy document, and we're already talking to Congress about this. We want to change the ERISA law itself.
Yeah.
So that, you know, I've been at US SIF now through a couple of administrations. I have never had an administration where I haven't had to either try to move ERISA forward or try to stop it being moved backward. This is a crazy way to work. It's bad for fiduciaries. It's really bad for plan participants. It's not great for new political appointees at the DOL. So we think the time is there to actually change the ERISA law. So it says that, you know, it is perfectly acceptable to look at ESG criteria in ERISA governed plans and to vote your proxies, so that we do not have this political football back and forth every time an administration changes. So we're going to try to do that. We're also going to try to reverse the rule makings at the DOL related to ERISA, both of them, proxy voting and ESG integration.
So one final question is coming up in the context of policy, and let's consider this the last one, and then perhaps use it as a segue to just final reflections, Lisa. So it's a simple kind of partisan question. Many people might infer from what you're saying that sustainable investing is a partisan thing, that you do well under Democratic administrations rather than Republican administrations. So this question is just about the bipartisan support needed to do this. How is that done? I mean, is this a partisan endeavor, sustainable investing?
Well, partisan to work with the DOL and the SEC and others. We have worked with them. We have still reached out to them and spoken with them, and we've spoken to Republicans on this House and Senate committees that are relevant. The Senate is, of course, a Republican body of Congress right now, and so leadership is in the Republican hands. So I don't think investors and institutions are partisan, I do think that these issues have tended to break substantively for politicians at the national level the last several years in a partisan way. And that's what's left for us to deal with.
Well, final reflections. I do see a few more questions, but I know we're coming to the top of the hour, and I do want to give Lisa the closing remarks. If you want to continue to engage with us, if we haven't been able to answer your specific question, don't hesitate to reach out to Lisa, to the team here at Croatan Institute. We'll be happy to try to direct you accordingly if you've got more questions. But final thoughts, Lisa, as we come to the end of 2020.
Gosh. Well, let's hope 2021 is better. Let's hope we can deal with this pandemic. Let's hope that there is just incredible energy putting around addressing 200 to 300 years in this country, longer than that, of deeply systemic racism. And not just in the African-American community, but across so many different communities of color, including Indigenous people. I'm excited. That's one of the things I actually see in this administration, incoming administration, that is new. This focus both on really looking at diversity in appointments, but the conversation about Native Americans is different to anything I have seen in 20 years. And I think that is something we should all keep an eye on. And I think it's very exciting. Potential outcome is that Indigenous people finally get the attention that they deserve in this country over the next 4 years. I'm hopeful. I just think we also should think about how each of us individually, outside whatever firms we work at or nonprofits we work at, can be enablers. And so that means both how do we engage at policy levels, put all your local and national politicians on your press list. That's a great takeaway from this. Find out how you can have a responsible investment option in your retirement plan if you don't. I always like giving people these actionable activities that they themselves can undertake, because some of the bigger picture policy issues are much more long-term and difficult. And then I think, every one of us probably has a different idea slightly of what great sustainable or impact investing looks like. What is real ESG? It's up to all of us to really demand the highest standards, to ask for transparency and accountability, to push back when we think it's not going the right way, and to be honest about it. We are advocates for the field, but we're also advocates for the best kind of field. And I think we're all responsible for that.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Lisa. It's been a real pleasure to have a longer dialogue with you about trends here at the end. It's always great to collaborate with you and your team. So just heartfelt thanks to you, our speaker. I want to also thank our donors and other partners for supporting this conversation. If you'd like to support other Croatan conversations because you enjoyed this dialogue that Lisa and I have had, there are a lot of different ways of doing that going forward. You can consider asking your organization to become a sponsor of a future conversation. You can make a donation at croataninstitute.org/donate, or when you're registering for future conversations, you can make a donation as you sign up, even though our conversations are free. You can also provide feedback using the survey form that pops up at the end of the conversation, or by emailing our team directly at conversations@croataninstitute.org. Lastly, keep the conversation going. Find us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, subscribe, follow, and take a look at our next Croatan conversation that's coming up in the new year. In January, on the 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Again, Croatan Institute Senior Fellow and Reefs Director Charlene Brown is going to lead a great conversation on investing in racial equity a half century after the civil rights movement. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great holiday season and see you in the new year.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.